The summer sun of 1879 wasn't just hot, it was cruel. It beat down on Calico Ridge, turning the dust of the town square into a thick, choking haze of heat and judgment. And on a rough wooden stage, right in the center of it all, a woman knelt in chains. Her name was Clara. Her dress was torn, still stained with the blood of childbirth, and pressed against her chest was a newborn baby, its cries so weak they were barely a whisper. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air, sharp as a whip. 2 for 1, a woman, young enough to mend, and a babe to grow your legacy, the crowd roared. They jeered and they laughed, as if a human life was just livestock to be haggled over. Sweat and dust and blood mixed on Clara's skin, but her back stayed ramrod straight. Her lips were a thin, silent line. She was a picture of dignity in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. And nobody seemed to care. Clara kept her head bowed, her body a map of exhaustion and pure, uncut defiance. The dress was just rags clinging to her skin. In her arms, the tiny infant whimpered, its small chest barely rising and falling, a fragile protest against the noise. The iron chain locked around her ankle bit into raw skin, heavy and merciless. It anchored her to the planks like an object, not a woman, not a mother. The crowd's laughter was a coarse, careless thing. "Still bleedin' fresh," one man hollered, and his words were swallowed by more jeers. Every cruel joke was louder than the baby's thin breath, louder than the steady hammer of Clara's heart in her ribs. But she didn't look up. She just pressed her lips to the infant's hair, offering a comfort she refused to ask for herself. On that stage, mocked and bound, she gave them no tears, no pleas, only the quiet strength of a mother refusing to let cruelty have the last word. The auctioneer's chant rattled on, a cruel rhythm marking the sale of a soul. 70, 100. Who'll give me 150? 200 from the man with the toothpick. The bids climbed. With every new number, Clara's breath grew shallower. Her grip on her infant tightened, as if she could physically shield the child from being bartered away like a sack of grain. And then, through the chaos, a new voice cut through, clean as steel on stone. 300. The square went dead silent. Boots stopped shifting. Jeers died in men's throats. Every single eye turned toward the figure standing at the edge of the crowd. His name was Thomas. He stood tall, dust clinging to his faded coat, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing most of his face. He didn't look like much, until you saw his eyes. They were cold, steady, and unblinking. They held the kind of authority no gavel could ever command. The auctioneer stammered, his greasy grin faltering. 300, you say? I said it once, Thomas replied, his voice like gravel. 300. A heavy hush fell over Calico Ridge, and for the first time that afternoon, the hottest thing in that square wasn't the sun. It was the weight of one man's presence, silencing a town's cruelty with a price too steep for mockery. The air felt thick enough to choke on. The auctioneer cleared his throat, praying for another voice, any voice, to break the spell. None came. The only sound was the weak cry of Clara's child. 300, the auctioneer repeated, his jaw tight. Sold. The gavel struck the wood. A thin, final sound. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Charity at that price. Madness. But no one dared say it out loud. Thomas's hand rested calmly on the revolver at his hip. Not a threat. Just a reminder that his word was iron. He mounted the stage, his boots thudding against the planks. Clara didn't even lift her head until she heard the scrape of steel against iron. His knife slid clean through the chain at her ankle. The shackle clattered to the floor, the sound of freedom in a place built for bondage. She blinked up at him, distrust carved deep into her face. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. His reply was simple, no ornament. No trick. A bed. Sleep. That's all. Then we talk. Like people. Gasps stirred among the onlookers. They were baffled by this bizarre act of mercy in a market that thrived on cruelty. But Thomas didn't waver. He placed a steady hand on Clara's back, guiding her off the block. Bloodstained and barefoot, she was no longer alone. She stepped down into a silence more profound than any auctioneer's shout had ever been. The crowd parted for them, slow, uncertain. Were they watching an act of incredible folly or incredible defiance? Thomas stepped down first, then turned, his hand hovering for a moment before settling lightly at the small of her back. The gesture wasn't ownership. It wasn't pity. It was just a guide. Barefoot, she followed him. Each step was fresh pain on already torn soles. A faint trail of blood marked the wooden boards behind her, a silent testament to what she had endured. But her chin stayed level. The newborn stayed pressed tight against her chest. The murmurs that were once jeers now faltered, caught somewhere between disbelief and a grudging respect. Thomas didn't hurry. His boots struck the ground with a measured certainty, daring anyone to block their path. When one man sneered, the sheer weight of Thomas's gaze silenced him faster than any words could have. Together they moved beyond the stage, beyond the reach of cruel laughter. By the time they stepped onto the open road, Clara was no longer just the girl from the block. She was someone walking away, steady, under a stranger's impossible protection. The ride from town ended at dusk. The land spread out, wide and dark, under the first shimmer of stars. Thomas led Clara past the main house, his voice quiet and brief. Behind the corral there was a small side cabin, weathered but clean. Inside, a narrow cot weighted with fresh sheets. There was a cradle, repaired with mismatched nails, and a stove that still held the warmth of banked embers. A folded quilt lay at the foot of the bed, as if someone had been expecting her. "This is yours," Thomas said simply. He set a kettle on to heat and left a bowl of oatmeal beside the cradle. For a woman who had been sold like an animal just hours before, the gesture felt like a dream. But Clara did not soften. She placed her baby in the cradle, then turned, her eyes avoiding his. "If you try to touch me," she said, her voice cracked but unbreakable, "I will slit your throat in your sleep." Thomas just nodded, completely unoffended. "That is fair." He tipped his hat and stepped out, closing the door softly behind him. For the first time in months, Clara was surrounded by a silence that wasn't hostile. Alone in that cabin, she sat by the cradle, a knife tucked under her pillow. A fragile line of safety had been drawn, and respected. But she wondered for how long. Kindness this strange, in a world this cruel. It had to be a lie. It had to be. That first night, Clara did not sleep. She sat with her back bolted to the wall, her infant nestled against her, feeding in small, fretful gulps. Every creak of the rafters was a threat. Every sigh of the wind was a warning. Her fingers kept brushing against the knife hidden beneath her pillow. A final line of defense for when this kindness finally showed its true, cruel face. But the room around her offered nothing but quiet. The sheets were clean. The stove breathed a faint warmth. On the table rested a jar of mashed oats and a bottle of milk, left without a word, without a demand. Hours passed. The baby settled deeper into her arms, sighing into a fitful sleep. Clara's eyes never closed, but something deep inside her, a knot of pure terror, began to shift. The silence here was not the silence of chains. It wasn't the silence of a predator waiting to strike. It was the silence of space, a promise unspoken. Fragile, but for now it was real. Morning crept into the cabin with a pale, cold hush. Clara stirred, the knife still clutched in her hand, the child warm against her chest. When her eyes fell on the cradle, she froze. A square of white cloth rested on the edge. Its edges were frayed, but it was stitched with tiny, perfect bluebirds. This wasn't a threat. It was a gift. The door opened softly. Thomas stepped inside. His hands were full, but empty of menace. In one, he carried a jar of mashed apples. In the other, a bottle of milk warmed by the fire. He set them down without looking for thanks. His gaze lingered on the embroidered handkerchief. "My mother made that when I was a boy," he said quietly. "For my sister. She didn't make it through that winter." His voice didn't crack, but it carried the weight of a loss that had never healed. Clara's fingers trembled as she traced the tiny stitched birds. In town, they had called her chattel, girl, property. But here, this strange, silent man was offering a piece of his own past, as if to say her child was worthy of more than iron and dirt. She looked at him, her eyes sharp, suspicious. "Why give this to me?" Thomas met her gaze, his own eyes steady and clear. "Because your child deserves better than chains." The baby shifted, sighing in its sleep. Clara gently placed the cloth back in the cradle. For the first time since the auction block, the ground beneath her felt a little less like a punishment, and a little more like the first, fragile step toward something she couldn't yet name. The days that followed passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Thomas never intruded. He never crossed the threshold of her cabin without being invited. But every morning she would find something waiting for her on the doorstep. A loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a pitcher of fresh milk, sometimes a folded blanket. Once, a book with a pressed wildflower tucked between its pages. He left them quietly, without a knock or a word, as if he knew trust was something best planted in silence. At first, Clara kept the knife close. Her guard was always up. She moved like someone bracing for a blow that never came. But the steady rhythm of his small offerings began to soften the razor-sharp edges of her fear. The baby, whom she had named Samuel in the privacy of her own heart, grew stronger. His cheeks began to round out. His cries became less brittle. Some evenings Clara would even hum to him, a low, quiet sound, as if testing whether music could still live inside her. The townsfolk would have seen only the girl from the auction, the scar on her ankle a permanent brand of shame. But Thomas called her something different. One morning, as she was drawing water from the well, his voice carried across the yard. "Good morning, Miss Clara." She froze. The rope burned her palm as the bucket swung, water splashing against the stone. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Your name," Thomas replied simply, tipping his hat. "Seemed wrong that no one was using it." Clara whispered the word to herself, half in disbelief. Miss Clara, her name, spoken as if it belonged to her. For the first time, she let it hang in the air without flinching. The stillness of the ranch was shattered by the thunder of hooves. 4 riders cut across the pasture, dust billowing around them like smoke from a fire. Their faces carried the same smug cruelty Clara remembered from the auction. Men who laughed while she was in chains. One of them leaned from his saddle, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "She's property," he barked, his voice ugly. "Registry says she's unpaid. We've come to take her back." But before they could push any farther, Thomas stepped through the gate. He had a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, but his voice was colder than steel. "This land is mine," he said, his voice perfectly even. "And on my land I decide who is welcome." His gaze didn't waver. The men shifted in their saddles, their hands inching toward their belts. But there was something in Thomas's eyes that gave them pause. "You paid for her," their leader sneered. "We'll call it even. You give us the girl, you can keep your money." Thomas just shook his head. One slow, deliberate motion. "She has a name. She has lungs that draw breath. That means she is not for sale." The silence that followed was heavier than the dust hanging in the air. The riders exchanged glances, weighing the unflinching man at the gate. This wasn't going to be easy. Finally, their leader spat into the dirt. Not worth the trouble. He yanked his horse's reins, wheeled it around, and the others followed. Their hoofbeats faded toward the horizon. From the cabin door, Clara stood clutching Samuel, trembling but upright. For the first time since the chain fell from her ankle, she believed it. She actually believed that one man's word could stand like a stone wall between her and the cruel world that wanted to swallow her whole. That night, after the riders were long gone, the ranch felt quieter. The wind pressed at the shutters, but the silence inside felt different. Less brittle, more sure. Clara stood on the porch, Samuel tucked against her, the child's warmth an anchor in the cooling dusk. She looked at Thomas, took a steadying breath, and spoke, her voice like someone returning to their own skin after a long and terrible journey. "My name," she said, "is Clara Loreen." Thomas held her gaze. Nothing moved across his face, just a deep, respectful stillness. "Honored to meet you, Miss Loreen," he answered. Each word was careful, as if he were setting a lantern down where it couldn't be knocked over. The name settled between them, heavier than any chain, but lighter than dust on the wind. For Clara, it was the first time her name had been received without a price attached. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in fear for so long, finally unknotted. The air went all the way into her lungs. Something small and stubborn inside her, frozen solid for years, began to thaw. The nights on that ridge carried their own kind of terror. For Clara, silence was never empty. It was filled with echoes, the jeering voices, the clang of iron, the tearing pain of a child being dragged into a world that didn't want him. That night, the dreams came back, sharp as spurs. She was on the wooden stage again, bleeding, chained. Men's boots crowded around her, their voices laughing, spitting. She tried to shield her baby, but the sound of chains grew louder and louder until it swallowed her screams. She jolted awake with a gasp, her chest heaving. Samuel startled, whimpering in her arms. Sweat plastered her hair to her temples. Her mouth tasted of blood and dust that weren't there. Through the haze of her terror, a flicker of light caught her eye. Beyond the small window, a lantern burned, a steady gold in the dark. Thomas was sitting on the porch, a coat draped around his shoulders, his hat in his lap. He was just sitting there, a watchman who had no intention of sleeping. Clara, still trembling, opened her door and stepped out. Samuel was cradled against her. The night air was cool, the stars scattered like salt on a black cloth. Thomas rose slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment. He held out a tin cup. "Bad dream?" he asked gently. His voice held no demand, no probing questions. Just recognition. Her hands shook as she took the cup. The steam rose, soft and fragrant. Chamomile. Lavender. She brought it to her lips. The heat stung her tongue, but it steadied her pulse. Thomas didn't fill the silence with useless words. He just said, "No one is going to touch you here, not while I'm on this ranch." Her eyes burned. "How can you promise that?" He shook his head. "I don't promise, I keep watch." Something inside her shifted. A promise could be broken. She had lived that truth down to the bone. But the act of keeping watch, night after night, that was different. That wasn't a word. It was an act of endurance. She looked up at the brilliant, star-filled sky. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a witness. When she finally went back inside, she left the door ajar. A small thing, but it was enough. It was enough to say she believed him. The morning came softer than she expected. Frost clung to the windows, but sunlight stretched in long, golden lines across the floor. Clara rose before the rooster crowed, Samuel tucked securely in a sling against her chest. For weeks, she had hidden inside the cabin, listening to the world through its thin walls. But not today. With careful steps, she walked barefoot into the dirt yard. Her hands, though thin and scarred, learned quickly. Thomas had shown her once how to tether the goats, how to set the grain. After that, she moved with an instinct that felt older than memory. She fetched water from the well. She hung Samuel's tiny clothes on the line to dry. She coaxed the stove into a steady flame. There was no chatter, no wasted motion, just the quiet rhythm of someone reclaiming their life, one small task at a time. Thomas watched from the porch, leaning against a post. "You don't have to work," he said when the sun pressed down hard and sweat darkened the hair at her temples. She looked up, dirt on her arms, her breath steady. "I don't want to sleep forever," she answered simply. The words hung between them, heavier than the hoe in her hand. It wasn't defiance. It was a declaration of survival. She had slept for too long in fear and chains and a half-life that wasn't living at all. This work wasn't a burden. It was how she was waking herself up again. Thomas just nodded once, a quiet respect in his eyes. Later, when she pulled a loaf of fresh bread from the oven and set it on the sill to cool, a faint curve touched her lips. Not a real smile, not yet, but something real, something fragile, something alive. The afternoon wind carried the scent of wheat. Thomas was leaning on the porch rail, coffee growing cold in his hand. He watched Clara working near the stable for a long time before he spoke. His voice was low, almost buried by the wind. "My sister's name was Laura." Clara paused, her hoe still in the dirt. She lifted her head, but she didn't speak. "She was 12, Thomas continued, when a man came to my father with promises, schooling in the East, a better life. My father, he took the money. I was 18, old enough to know better, old enough to stop it. But I didn't." His jaw clenched, the words scraping out of him like stones. "By the time I went looking for her, the trail ended at an auction town, just like Calico Ridge. She was gone. No name on any list. Just a necklace she used to wear, left behind in a drawer like it was trash." He didn't cry. His gaze remained fixed on the fields of wheat, shimmering in the late light. "I've carried her absence ever since," he said finally. Clara moved to stand quietly beside him, Samuel's soft breath rising against her shoulder. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She just shared the silence with him. The gold field whispered in the wind, and the two of them, scarred by different paths but bound by the same unspoken grief, stood together and listened. The sharp clang of metal shattered the afternoon quiet. Thomas had been repairing a hinge on a stall door when the ladder shifted beneath him. The crash echoed through the ranch, sending Clara running from the garden. Samuel balanced on her hip. She found him sprawled in the hay, his jaw set, a deep gash blooming red across his forearm. "You're supposed to be the smart one," she snapped, her breath uneven. She lowered the baby to a blanket and dropped to her knees beside him. "Not today," Thomas muttered through clenched teeth. She half dragged, half guided him to the porch and forced him to sit. "You need stitching," she said firmly. "I'll be fine." "You'll be infected," she countered, already boiling water and gathering clean rags. Her hands shook just once, but when she set the needle to thread, they were steady. She cleaned the wound with a practiced precision, then bent over his arm, sewing the skin together with careful, deliberate stitches. Thomas didn't flinch. His gaze never left her face. He watched the way the shadows from her eyelashes trembled on her cheeks, the way her mouth softened even as she worked with such fierce focus. "You're not afraid," he said quietly. "I am," Clara whispered back, her fingers tightening on the cloth. "But not of you." The words struck him deeper than the needle ever could. When she finished, she tied the bandage tight, then sat back on her heels and met his steady eyes. That night, after the chores were done and Samuel was asleep, Thomas found a note folded neatly beside his supper plate. 6 simple words in Clara's careful hand. "Thank you for not giving up." He held the paper for a long time, his rough thumb tracing the letters. Something that had been frozen inside him for years finally shifted, like a hard field after a long rain, ready at last to grow again. But peace, in a place like this, is a fragile thing. The sun was hanging mercilessly over Calico Ridge when the trouble came back. 4 riders thundered up to the ranch, their dusters snapping in the wind like banners of menace. At their head was a tall man with a crooked smile and rings gleaming on his fingers. He was the man who had owned her, the one who had put her on that stage. He dismounted with the confidence of someone who believed the law bent to his will. In his hand was a folded paper, a contract. "She belongs to me," he declared, holding it high. "Bought fair and square. Unless you want to refund the $300, she rides with us today." Thomas stepped forward, calm but immovable as a mountain. "She bled through her dress while chained to your stage," he said, his voice low. "There is no fairness in that." The man's smile sharpened. "Then perhaps we'll settle this another way. Noon, tomorrow, Main Street." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. From inside the cabin, Clara stood clutching her child, her eyes wide with terror. Thomas didn't even glance back at her. His voice was steady, final. "Fine. Noon." Word spread like wildfire. By the next day, Calico Ridge was a silent crucible. Shops were shuttered, children were hidden away. Men gathered along the edges of the street, murmuring bets they barely believed in. Thomas stood alone in the open, sleeves rolled up, his jaw set like iron. Across from him, the other man flexed his fingers over a pearl-handled pistol, grinning as if he was already savoring the victory. The sheriff stood between them, his voice cracking over the tense silence. "On my count. 3." The world narrowed to a heartbeat and a cloud of dust. 2. Clara, watching from the edge of an alley, pressed Samuel to her chest so tightly he whimpered. 1. The pistols barked almost at the same time. The other man's shot went wild, scorching the air. Thomas's bullet found its mark. It ripped cleanly through the man's shoulder, spinning him into the dirt with a howl. His gun clattered uselessly at his side. A gasp rippled through the crowd. But Thomas didn't gloat. He walked forward, each step deliberate, reloading his pistol with the calm of someone who didn't need noise to prove his power. He stood over his fallen challenger, his words cold and clear for the whole town to hear. "Men don't buy lives, and I don't shoot to kill when justice will do." He turned and walked away, leaving the sheriff and the townsfolk to gather up the wounded man, leaving Clara to finally breathe again, and leaving Calico Ridge with a memory it would not soon forget. The duel was over, but the battle wasn't. That night, Clara's body finally gave way. A fever burned through her, leaving her drenched in sweat, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She tried to rise to soothe her crying baby, but her knees buckled. Thomas was there before she could fall, his arms steady as he carried her back to the cot. For 3 days and 3 nights, he became the silent guardian of both mother and son. He boiled water and cooled cloths, pressing them gently to her forehead. When Samuel wailed with hunger, Thomas rocked the infant against his own broad chest, his rough hands clumsy but tender as he held the bottle. He hummed tunelessly into the night, keeping watch until the child's tiny fists unclenched in sleep. By day he tended the ranch with weary eyes. By night he returned to her bedside, never complaining, never resting. On the 4th morning, light spilled through the cabin window. Clara's eyes fluttered open. The fever had broken. She turned her head, and the sight that met her eyes stole the breath from her lungs. Thomas was asleep on the floor beside her cot, and curled safely in his arms was Samuel. His broad frame was slumped with exhaustion, his face softened in a rare moment of vulnerability. The infant's cheek was pressed against his shirt, rising and falling with his steady breath. It was no grand declaration, no vow spoken aloud. But to Clara it was clearer than any promise. Here, in the quiet morning light, was the shape of a family, born not of bargains or chains, but of a care so deep and so freely given. In the lonely hours when no one else was watching, the frost finally loosened its grip on the land, and with the spring came a steadier strength in Clara's steps. One morning she stood by the fence, Samuel on her hip, and gazed toward a weathered, sagging back room of the main ranch house. "There are others," she said quietly. Thomas was on the porch, coffee in hand. He looked up. He didn't need her to explain. He knew she meant women like her, women still carrying wounds no one could see. "What do you want to do?" he asked simply. Not with doubt, not with resistance, just an open space for her answer. "I want to fix it up," Clara said, her tone firm. "A bed, a stove, a roof that doesn't leak, a place where no one has to be afraid." Thomas nodded once, slow but certain. Whatever she chose to build, he would be there, hammer in hand, his shoulder beside hers. Dawn broke, soft and gray over the ridge. By then the back room had been remade, fresh planks nailed firm, pale blue paint still smelling of turpentine. An iron bed set neatly with quilts. Word traveled quietly, the way such things do. Women began to come, one with a split lip, another clutching a Bible so tight her knuckles were white. Clara welcomed them all with no questions, only hot tea and the steady, quiet rhythm of safety. Then one morning, with fog still clinging low to the grass, she found something at the barn door. A scrap of tobacco paper with a single name scribbled in charcoal. And beneath it, swaddled in torn cloth, was a newborn baby. The child's cry pierced the dawn, thin and desperate. Clara dropped to her knees, her arms trembling as she lifted the tiny bundle. The scent of river clay clung to the baby's skin. For a moment, memory struck her like a blade. The straw under her knees, the iron at her ankle, her own blood cooling in the dust. Tears blurred her sight, but when she pressed the baby to her chest, her weeping turned into something fierce. "She will not sleep outside," Clara whispered. "Not here. She will be warm." Thomas came to her side. He didn't speak. He just steadied the child's head with his own calloused hand, his silence a promise as Clara rocked the baby into the circle of her arms. The kitchen glowed with the low flicker of lamplight. Two children slept nearby, Samuel curled in his cradle, and the abandoned infant in a woven basket by the hearth. Their small breaths rose and fell in unison. Thomas dried his hands at the sink, then turned to Clara. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "I don't have a ring," he admitted, holding her gaze. "No gold. No land worth boasting about. But I have a name. If you ever want it, it's yours." Clara's breath caught. She saw not a transaction, not a man buying or claiming her. She saw an offering, a piece of himself laid bare. She stood slowly, her hand pressed to her heart. "I was sold," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Chained, displayed, treated like nothing." Her eyes glistened as she looked directly into his. "This time, I choose." Thomas stepped closer, his hand brushing her cheek, not with possession but with reverence. "So, is that a yes?" he asked, his voice more fragile than she had ever heard it. Clara nodded, tears finally breaking free. "Yes," she whispered, "not just to live, but to build with you." When he folded her into his arms, the fire in the hearth snapped gently, as if bearing witness. Behind them the two children stirred, but did not wake. Witnesses to a vow forged not by rings or altars, but by choice. Two souls, once broken, now binding themselves together, freely and forever. 2 years later, the homestead was no longer the lonely ranch Thomas had once tended alone. The garden was bigger, its rows of beans and squash winding between playpens where toddlers laughed and chased one another. Behind the main house stood a sturdy new bunkhouse, raised plank by plank. Above its door, a simple wooden sign carved by Thomas's hands read, "Rest here." And it was a place that lived up to its name. Women arrived weary, carrying bruises and memories, and children clinging to their skirts. Some stayed for a week, others for months. But each one departed with something they thought they had lost forever: dignity, strength, and most of all, their name. No one left unseen, no one left unnamed. Every night, by the light of a single oil lamp, Clara wrote in her journal, "This is a place where women sleep without fear." The ink bled across the page, but her words were as clear as any proclamation carved in stone. Thomas would sometimes read her entries quietly, never intruding. He showed his care with his hands, carving small wooden animals for the children, fixing a roof before it could leak, keeping the stove stocked with wood so no night ever grew too cold. Together they had built more than a ranch. They had built a promise. One autumn afternoon, Clara sat on the porch swing. Her daughter, a little girl they called Sparrow, was curled in her lap. The child's curious fingers traced the smooth, pale scar that still circled her mother's ankle like a faint iron bracelet. "What is this, Mamma?" Sparrow asked, her eyes wide. Clara hesitated. For years she had hidden it, covered it. But her daughter's innocent touch asked for the truth. She drew a slow breath. "That," she said gently, "was a lock someone once put on me, because they forgot I was a person." Sparrow frowned, wrinkling her nose. "That's silly," she declared with all the certainty of a child. "No one will ever lock you again." Clara's throat tightened. She kissed her daughter's small hand. "No, baby," she whispered. "Not ever again." The scar had once been a brand of humiliation, but in that moment it became something else, proof of survival, and a promise of protection that stretched forward into her daughter's lifetime. The night stretched quiet over the Texas ridge, the sky pricked with stars so sharp they seemed to cut the dark apart. Thomas sat on the porch steps, his arm draped around Clara, while Sparrow and the other children chased fireflies, their squeals of delight like tiny bells in the dusk. Later, when the children were all asleep, Clara pulled her worn journal into her lap. On the final page she paused, her pen hovering. Then she wrote, "I was once bought for less than a horse, but I was loved like a human. And in the end, that is the only price that ever mattered." She set the book aside and leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder. He said nothing. He just squeezed her hand. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, full of firelight and laughter and the steady, quiet heartbeat of a home that had been built, not bought. Out here, in the wide and wind-beaten West, heroes didn't always ride in with badges and bullets. Sometimes they just gave a stranger a bed, let her sleep without fear, and guarded that fragile peace until it grew into a family. If you believe that mercy can be a beginning, and that love, steady as the stars, can build a home in the harshest of places, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because there are always more stories hidden in the shadows, just waiting for the light.